We all know about the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, don't we? He is one of the most influential modern thinkers, and he spent a lot of time explaining and understanding the Western tradition of religion and philosophy, morality, and out of that, some really interesting works emerged. Namely, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is perhaps the most famous one. Then there is The Birth of Tragedy, then Beyond Good and Evil, and the other one which I'm going to discuss today, it's called On the Genealogy of Morals. And in this book, On the Genealogy of Morals, what Nietzsche does is he investigates the contemporary Christian morality. In fact, he pretty much intends to expose the moral goodness and badness that we have in the Christian framework. Now, when he talks about this investigation of Christian morality, one might wonder why do we do that? What is the need for that? And in fact, there are some out there who might believe that morality is some kind of a transcendent and immutable thing. It's handed down to us by God. And Nietzsche pretty much disagrees to that view. He shows how morality has evolved over time. And hence, he tries to undermine the point that the morality is God-given and absolute. And he does that by step by taking out the bricks that build it up. But he doesn't want to discard all these bricks through which we have built our morality. He wants to create a new moral system which would serve us better in this day and age. And the earlier one, the Christian moral system, he feels, is outdated. So as I said, he does recognize the importance of morality. He acknowledges that when you have a shared morality, it can help create a sense of community, and it can also keep a check on natural tendencies, which can be sometimes barbaric and even tear our society apart. So he starts by revealing the ancestry of these moral ideas. And he talks about this Christian morality and its ancestry in a psychological sense. So he says that in ancient Rome, when the Christian morality, when it first began to emerge, most of these Christians were slaves, and their aristocratic masters, they had some kind of amoral or non-moral conception of good and bad. So on the one hand, these masters were strong, powerful, and brave, and on the other hand, the slaves were weak and meek. So that's where Nietzsche tells us that this is where this morality actually emerges. These slaves were powerless, and they couldn't do anything. But one thing they knew was that they hated and they resented their masters. And it was precisely out of this resentment that Christian morality grew. This feeling of hostility that slaves had for their masters. They could not physically act on this hostility feeling, but they were consumed with hatred and revenge. So they came up with this new moral code through which they could achieve some kind of superiority over their masters. So, in a sense, Nietzsche says Christians started doing which you'd find in the internet world a lot of people doing these days. That they create a new moral way of describing good and bad when they cannot exert any other power. So you'd find a lot of young people these days virtue signaling all the other famous and successful people, telling them they are not good and they don't have a sense of social justice. So this is in one way of feeling superior over somebody over whom you cannot exert any power. So this is what Christians did. They developed this moral code of good and bad, and in effect they reversed their masters' use of those terms. So while the masters took pride in their bold and courageous attitude, the new morality that emerged through this, the weak and the meek and the pitiable, they were considered good now. And of course, the idea of God helps. So it was believed and taught that God valued these kind of qualities and virtues and rewarded those people who possessed these qualities. So in effect, what slaves were saying that we may not have a very high place in the society as of now, but God is going to reward us. And God is going to punish those who are against us at this very moment. And it is right here that Nietzsche finds the roots of the Christian morality. So on one side, he recognizes that there is, in Christian morality, there is this elevation of compassion and altruism and even pity, but it is virtually coming from the feeling of hatred and resentment. But this was all fine as long as only slaves were judging their masters. But the final act of revenge was that the masters to judge themselves and other people apart from these masters and slaves, to judge these masters from this new Christian perspective. So clearly the slaves were winning the battle here. So according to Nietzsche, human beings, we have a natural drive to impose our will and power on others. And in some ways, we derive pleasure from controlling and even sometimes instilling pain and suffering in others. And he gives the example of a child who pulls the wings of an insect for fun. I've been guilty of that, so I can understand this point. So when this outward drive is frustrated, it manifests itself in other ways. It can be turned inwards in an unhealthy and self-destructive way. So what happened was, as the new Christian morality began to take hold, is that once the masters, they began to embrace this new moral code, so their will to power, that could no longer be exerted outwardly in the same spontaneous way, and they could no longer impose their will on the slaves without any guilt. And they began to develop something Nietzsche calls a Christian conscience, and they began tormenting themselves with guilt. So the slaves' revenge was now complete. They were in some ways the superior group, and their masters, they were the inferior ones. And if you follow this explanation from Nietzsche, you can find some similarities in Gandhi's struggle against the British. So in some ways you can say Gandhi was through his pacifism, what he was doing is, instead of exerting his power and force against the British, he was trying to make them feel guilty about it. And that really stays, that feeling of guilt stays in an individual and a community. So if we see it through Nietzschean lens, it's not really that the slaves were fooling their masters or Gandhi was fooling the colonizers. These people themselves were fooling themselves, and their own motives were not really selfless or just compassion, but some kind of resentment, obviously expressed in different form. And in fact, you can see similar themes in many other religions, where the practices of self-denial and self-flagellation, they are kind of manifestation of this inwardly turned will to power. And of course, it's there in Christianity too. So according to Nietzsche, this self-destructive, self-denying tendency, it became an ideal, something that everybody was encouraged to aspire for. So then he goes on to say that no doubt it was useful in a particular time and place, in those settings, but it doesn't serve that purpose anymore. The revenge has been taken, and that's it. And at the same time, Nietzsche wants to help us recognize that there is nothing inevitable about our current morality, and we should understand that. And we should work on changing our values, the value system. And we need to get out of this prison of Christian morality and embrace a new set of values that will eventually allow us to flourish in a psychologically healthier and more positive way. And of course, we are not slaves anymore. We don't have a resentment against our masters. We're not doing the same thing that early Christians were doing. So he suggests a new moral code. And one might think that the new moral code, as per Nietzsche's explanation, would be utterly selfish and only concerned about imposing our wills on others. But that's not really the case. He has that place for compassion and goodness. But what he advocates here is just that we need to have these qualities and all these values for the right reason. We can't just be blindly following these values just because they have been passed down to us. We need to question that, and we need to come up with the values that can serve us the best in today's world.